I don't care how many of y'all are 5-0ing in the leagues and having your own personal success. Let's be honest here and let's be real. Let's get down to the opinionated facts. Modern Mill isn't doing so hot. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for people to spike out a league. You get it up against some good matchups. And to be frank, you get a little bit lucky and you get there. Sometimes, most times actually, it's better to be lucky than good. But I want to talk about why Modern Mill is not in a great state. And I think there's a lot of thought to be had in terms of why that is, how that can change, and how the archetype and its players can kind of improve looking forward. So strap on in. This is going to be a great video to just, again, leave on in the background. The visuals are here for anyone that wants to see them, but I don't know. Throw on your earphones, do something else. Let's talk Modern Mill. Now, I'm going to talk about the state of this archetype from the perspectives of the resources we have right now, what we're doing well, and then go into a meta discussion about why I think the archetype itself isn't doing that well, and then potentially provide some reasons for that and, some looking forward. So the timestamps are going to be big here, and I'm hoping I can cover everything and just not make this a 30-40 minute video. Just something for people to think about and open some discussion and see where we can kind of brainstorm ourselves moving forward. And I personally think there's a way I'm definitely going to be moving forward with Mill. So check that out right at the end with the conclusion. But let's walk through this. In terms of the various different archetypes, there are about three or four overlying archetypes that generally players have explored from a competitive perspective. First and foremost, we have the classical Demir Mill, an archetype that wants to take advantage of the Mill package, that it's primarily blue, for cards like Drown in the Loch, for cards like Fatal Push, and Crypt Incursion. Now, Drown in the Loch is obviously an extremely powerful magic card. We see it in the Death Shadow decks. Giving Mill the ability to counter something or top deck and kill something is fantastic. The problem is we have a lot of cards these days that are very low cost, very efficient. Thinking Flusterstorm that's entered the format, mainboard Spell Pierces. So sometimes a card like this can be very difficult, and especially against Delve spells. If a graveyard's empty, Drown doesn't do much. But obviously it gets some bonuses against combo decks right now, such as Crashing Footfalls, where their primary combo piece is 0 mana, so you don't really need any cards in graveyard to counter something like that. Other than that, we have Fatal Push, so a deck that usually runs 7 to 8 fetch effects, and then we have Field Ruins. Our crabs are usually dying. There's a lot of times to get the Revolt, so it's going to be 1 mana at instant speed, destroying a creature from CMC 0 all the way to 4. A lot of permanents that we can think of, obviously Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, and then we have things like 3-drops, a lot of 3-drops in the format, such as Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and things just escape my mind, but there's a lot of targets for it. And then finally Crypt Incursion, so a little bit weaker now in the sense that there aren't a lot of tribal strategies out there. So if humans and goblins aren't really in the meta, Crypt Incursion's not that great, and Demir Mill's not going to gain that much oomph from a card like this. Next up, we have Azorius Mill, which kind of takes the concepts of Demir Mill, but kind of flips it on its head by providing and taking advantage of more powerful tools that have more stark downsides. So first and foremost is Prismatic Ending, giving us the ability to now target non-creature permanents. So we can now kill 3 mana Teferi, we can kill Colossus Hammer, we can kill various other enchantments, but on the downside of sorcery speed and having to play a greedier mana base, aka being worse on life, having to fetch a little bit trickier, and things like that. So Prismatic Ending can be a little bit difficult, but it gives us access to the tools to further attack different strategies from different angles. Then, usually in the Azorius builds, you aren't running something like Drown in the Loch. That would essentially be Esper. So they make up for it in something like Remand. So a card that helps create velocity in the strategy and then create delay. So especially against something where they're hard casting spells, or heck, even Crashing Footfalls or Living End, if you remand the spell, it goes back to their hand and then it's not getting cascaded into. It's actually a pretty solid counterspell in that sense. And again, creating velocity by drawing through our deck at instant speed. Finally, you can get access to powerful tools such as Rest in Peace or Path to Exile, which I'm later going to talk about. But Rest in Peace is a fantastic option, especially if the graveyard is especially if the meta is graveyard heavy, if you're expecting a lot of endurances, if you just want cards to stay out of the library Rest in Peace is a solid option. And then finally, Teferi Time Raveler is something you can consider. It's a little bit higher on the curve, and a lot of people have found that, you know, especially in the time of Luros, it wasn't really a card worth splashing for with Luros. So right now, is this something that does something that Mill wants? Not really. It doesn't mill. It only draws cards. It affects the board in a very slow way. So sometimes it's worth it. Most of the time, not. Next up, we have Esper Mill, and now Esper is going to take advantage of cards like Drown in the Loch and Prismatic Ending. So you're combining the best of both worlds, but again, creating a more punishable mana base in the Esper sense. I can't remember if I said that for Azorius, which is not true. I meant that for Esper. But again, for Prismatic Ending specifically, you usually want access to multiple colors of mana to create a more punishing mana base. And so this is why things like this are difficult. But you do get access to cool cards like Kaya's Guile, giving us the ability for instant speed sack effects, which are great against the rare Bogles player. And then, the rare, especially the rare Emrakul that gets cheated in. They have protection from instants, doesn't mean they have protection from sacrificing it. So they sacrifice that, that's great. You got life gain, you got a blocker, a little bit of everything. Kai's Guile is pretty solid. And then finally we have Sultai Mill, which actually I think I'm the highest on. I'm not gonna lie. You play Sultai primarily as Dimir Splash Green. And you play it for Assassin's Trophy, you play it for Weather the Storm, but primarily it's going to be Veil of Summer, which I actually want to return to at the end of this video, so I'm not going to go too far into Sultai Mill right now. Just know those are the big 4 archetypes in Mill, and their various strengths and weaknesses in terms of the reasons why we play them and the cards that we get access to, but we're going to return to Sultai Mill in a second. So what's the problem? Ultimately, Mill is not doing great, so if I've listed all these strengths and weaknesses, if Mill has always been good at attacking big mana, you know, Amulet's a big deck in the format right now, why isn't Mill doing good? If Crashing Footfalls is a big combo deck in the format right now, and Mill takes advantage of Surgical Extraction to the best of its ability, why isn't Mill good right now? Let's take a look at the metagame, and we can look at 3 specific matchups that I want to highlight to further elaborate on the problem. So if we look at the metagame itself, at 12% we have Murktide, then Burn, Amulet, Crashing Footfalls, Hammer, Yawgmoth, Living End, Blink, 5-color Omnath, which are essentially 2 different versions of the same deck, Shadow. And the way we want to think about this is there's a lot of aggressive strategies, mid-range strategies, and tempo strategies. In a large sense, these are hard archetypes for Mill to deal with. With big mana and some types of aggro and some types of combo graveyard being perfectly fine, tempo and mid-range and sometimes aggro as well are very difficult for Mill to deal with, especially with Mill being largely a bad mid-range deck. You can't outrange another mid-range deck. You can't. So something like Blink and 5-color Omnath are going to be very difficult to deal with, especially with the levels of value that they create. And then something like Murktide Regent being hyper efficient and being the Delver deck of the format, the tempo strategy, and Death Shadow being a very similar play style in terms of tempo, it's going to be hard for us to deal with. So let's look into some of these archetypes a little bit more. I want to start off with Murktide Regent. An archetype that has, it stands the test of time. It is the best deck in the modern format right now for a lot of reasons. Cheap interactive spells, cheap and highly impactful aggressive threats, and it's very hard to deal with the accruing advantage. Something like a Ragavan that's left unattested is going to be very hard to deal with. It's going to be stealing your spells, creating ramp value to cast multiple spells a turn, and then Murktide Regent, if you leave one unchecked, the next one that comes down only grows the other one, and flying just being a very relevant form of evasion right now. There's a lot of things going on with this deck that are very difficult. Now, when you look at it from our perspective, we are feeding their graveyard. A lot of times they will search just to get a Ragavan out, put cards into their graveyard so that they can feed into their Murktide, and we're thinking, oh, okay, we can throw out an Archive Trap, but then we're feeding the Murktide Regent. We're allowing this to get bigger because not only are we not selectively putting cards in their graveyard, we are giving them a choice of instant and sorceries from their graveyard, and they're getting the choice of just leaving lands or leaving bad spells or leaving bad cards that we don't even want to surgical after. They're going to be able to take all the high priority targets. On top of that, why not just surgical it away? If Murktide is the ultimate problem and we have fatal pushes, we have removal like Drown to deal with the 1-drops, why don't we surgical Murktide away? Well, number one thing is, sometimes you don't have that surgical in your opening hand. If you deal with one Murktide, they've already played that Murktide. They've exiled other copies of other cards, so you don't really have a lot of surgical targets. You don't have the ability to cast Drown on that first Murktide most of the time because they've delved away their yard. They don't have anything to grow the Drown and give us valid targets for. But if we were to surgical away, why don't we cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter? And then once we get Murktide out, look at the CMC of their deck. It's actually pretty damn low. They have a lot of 0-drops in their lands. Mishra's Bauble's a 0-drop, and the rest of them pretty much all 1-drops. Unholy Heat, Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Chandler. We get a lot of mileage out of Tasha's Hideous Laughter. The problem is, what I was talking about with tempo, with cards like Mainboard Spell Pierce, it's very hard to get rid of 3-mana sorceries and inefficient spells in a deck playing very low to the ground, efficient 1 to 2 CMC counter magic, and especially 3 CMC counter magic that's never dead. Archmage's Charm is a counter spell, but it has draw effects. It has the ability to turn our crabs against us, and especially, grab a Hedron Crab and they can feed their own graveyard to cast their own Murktide, and you see kind of the value rolls from there. Ultimately, if this is going to be the best deck in the format, it's going to be very tough for Mill to keep up. Next up, we have something like Burn. If this is going to be the top deck in the top aggressive deck in the format, Burn has traditionally been one of the worst matchups for Mill over time. And I think with all the experience players have had in the Mill archetype, we've just given up on trying to play against this archetype as a whole. If it's going to be a large part of your local metagame, a lot of players, which I can go into later, or I've kind of talked about earlier as well, will usually just start playing Azorius Mill. In white, you get access to a lot better options in terms of tackling Burn, especially when you start to think about Dimir only having Crypt Incursion. The deck itself only plays, 12 creatures? Most of the time, they're just shooting you with spells. And then even the Eidolon, when it comes down, if you even manage to kill it, you're still taking damage, so it's not really that much of a positive exchange. Crypt Incursion isn't that great, so Dimir Mill tends to struggle against Burn, so then you implement tools such as Blossoming Calms, which gives you hexproof for 2 turns, evading spells for 2 turns, has that remand effect of just giving you time, and then you gain 2 life or 4 life over the casting of this spell. It's not bad. You essentially negate a Bolt or a Boros Charm, whatever it might be. It might be the life you need to give yourself that extra turn to draw the Tashas. But ultimately, you're switching into another color. You're losing the efficiency that is Fatal Push, that is Drown in the Lock, to ultimately play into colors to just beat Burn. And that's only one. You're not necessarily playing these colors to beat Murktide. And although you can play Path to Exile, pretty solid option against Murktide Regent. Later in the video, I'm going to talk about some of the problems that we have with even Path to Exile. But again, for now, Burn is still going to be a tough matchup. A lot of times, Mill players do not bother to even board against, play against, or build against Burn itself. Finally, the last archetype I want to kind of bring up in the whole why is Mill bad, and it's because this is a top deck in the format. Now, it's a combo deck, and Mill has historically been known to be one of the best houses for surgical extraction. And that's largely true. Surgical Extraction is one of the most busted cards in the Mill deck, and it's one of our best ways to interact with the modern format as a whole, and with other various Magic formats as a whole too. Like, you'll see Surgical Extraction being played in Legacy. If Surgical Extraction is powerful outside of Mill decks, it's obviously going to be powerful in them, blah, blah, blah. But this isn't just a combo deck. It's a combo mid-range deck. And ultimately what that means is it has a secondary plan. Once the Crashing Footfalls gets out, like, you just, once you Surgical Crashing Footfalls out, that doesn't mean you win, because even with something like Test of Talents out, they have things like Force of Negation. Remember that this is a combo that can go off at instant speed. So you might have the Surgical Extraction, you might be able to mill them out, and then, heck, you take away the Crashing Footfalls. But what if in game 2 they get smart and realize that Crashing Footfalls, you only need to suspend it for 1 green? And then you can't even surgical it out. Now you have to look for other surgical targets. Well, that's not bad. In game 2, you can surgical their endurances, you can surgical their forces, and then when it comes down, you can then use Surgical Extraction on a counterspell, which is literally Test of Talents. Fantastic card for anyone kind of looking for a new counterspell in their modern suite. You can then counter it that way and get their other copies. That's great. But then after all these resources that you've spent, they still have a mid-range plan. They still have Furies. They still have Brazen Borrowers. They still have Bone Crusher Giants. And that is the problem. You spend so many resources building a hand and constructing a flow of combat to beat this archetype that you lose your tempo and resources in such a way that you don't really have a great way to then combat the secondary onslaught of this deck, which is why ultimately, even though it is the combo strategy of the format, it doesn't mean that Mill has a favorable matchup in it. Historically, every combo deck out there has usually had a very favored, Mill has had a favored matchup against that archetype. Not the case here, especially finally if we kind of pop back to the list. This list isn't playing it, but lists will usually play Blood Moons in the side. Magus of the Moons. This deck's even playing 4 Mystical Dispute, 4 Endurance. Don't stop for a second and think they will not bring in all 8 of those cards against you. And then, not only are you trying to deal with the combo, but then you're trying to deal with Mystical Dispute, and then you're trying to deal with Endurance once you're ahead, and then you're ultimately trying to deal with a mid-range plan. Not a great matchup. So ultimately, what's my conclusion? Mill is trash in the modern metagame right now. And I don't want to say that's Mill's fault. I don't think it's the player's fault either. I think there's a lot of people being successful and getting their 5-0s and getting their wins where they are. And even myself, I get the rare 4-1, and I even in the leagues myself, I've been getting some 3-2s as well. You guys have been seeing some great games on my end, and I do post the rare like losing game if it does teach something. But ultimately, Mill's not doing well right now, and it's not just because of what the top decks are in the format. I think it's because of the Elemental Scourge from Modern Horizons 2. Now, I don't want to delve too deep into this topic. I know a lot of you avid fans out there of the channel and watchers of the channel know how I feel about the Elementals, but Luros wasn't the only problem. I even think Ragavan's fine. Ragavan's a pretty fair card. It's just like the epitome or the peak of a fair card. It is the model that all fair cards want to be at, the level, but ultimately it's a 1-drop, it gets removed, cool. The free spells are what the problem are. You have whole archetypes dedicated to them. Blink, 5-color elementals, even the combo decks of the format will use Fury. If you have the ability to take advantage of these cards, then why wouldn't you? You might say, why doesn't Mill take advantage of them? You have Subtlety, you have the black one as well. Well, the problem is that the black one is one of the worst ones out there, and Subtlety is like a joke. Another thing is that Mill has a very hard time making up for card advantage. You'll notice that the only card draw spell in the deck is Visions of Beyond, and of course, Fractured Sanity is a card draw, and most of the times you aren't even casting multiple copies. You're usually only casting 1 copy of Fractured Sanity throughout the game. The other copies are usually being cycled away to create graveyard fodder, surgical targets, build Visions of Beyond, whatever it might be. So that can be a cantrip as well, but it's a 2-mana card draw spell. Ultimately, there aren't a lot of ways to make up for card disadvantage. So if you're pitching a blue card, which are your mill spells, your crabs, your visions, your Ashioks, to bounce a spell, a card back to their hand, you better hope to have something to make up for that, because that creature that you just pitch for, that free spell you just pitched for, is not staying there. We don't play Ephemerate to keep these cards. We don't play things like Spreading Seas and 1-mana green enchantments to draw cards and just keep a steady flow of resources. We don't have these things available to us. Ultimately, I think the Elementals actually need to be banned out of the format. I think that would be a good step forward for Modern. I don't think they're a healthy piece to Modern. I think they could have been balanced a little bit more. I think they could have just not been free. They could have all costed 1 of the mana they're in. Like, Solitude could have cost 1 white. Fury could have, Endurance could have cost 1 green. Like, all this stuff. And then they become much more televised. You have to work around them. Or, even beyond that. Some of them could cost 2. Some of them could cost 1. Whatever. It could have been a lot more televised, and that way they're a lot more balanced. They might even be unplayable, but they're not breaking the Modern format. But at the end of the day, Mill's trash. We're getting away with a lot of free wins in the format against Hammer, Amulet, Tron, the odd creature deck. Heck, even Yawgmoth isn't a terrible matchup, but I don't even want to comment on that matchup because I haven't played it enough to really make a solid opinion. But even that one's not that bad of a matchup. But you do have to make a lot of changes. And what this is going to be is kind of the final concluding section of the video, where I want to talk about some of the things that I think Mill players need to start thinking about. And as an archetype, what can we do to improve our odds and build ourselves forward to make sure that we have the tools necessary to beat these bigger giants in the format? I think some of these things people aren't thinking about. So first and foremost, in white, we have access to Path to Exile, and that's important because we have things like Murktide to contest with. The problem I have with playing Esper and Azorius Mill for Path to Exile is that it's really only a solution for Murktide Regent. You do not want to Path to Exile a Ragavan. You do not want to Path to Exile a Dragon's Rage Chandler, because against a tempo strategy, you are giving them a land, you are giving them the tempo, you are giving them the resources to beat you for a temporary gain of just removing your creature. You would literally rather that Dragon's Rage Chandler hit you than you would actually kill it with the Path to Exile specifically. You would rather kill with a Fatal Push Prismatic, but you see my point here. Path to Exile is very difficult to justify beyond the Murktide matchup, beyond the Yawgmoth matchup. You don't want Path to Exile against the Blink strategies. Maybe you want it against 5-color Omnath. Probably not. You want it against Elementals, but even still, the Elementals enter the battlefield and they get their ETB trigger. Path to Exile doesn't do anything after that. Oh, they shuffle their library, you get an Archive Trav off, but again, against Murktide Regent, you're feeding their graveyard. Against Renin 6, you are giving them lands to bring back. You are giving them Urza Sagas to bring back from the yard and put onto the battlefield. You are providing them resources. You have to work a little bit harder than Path to Exile. Next up, I've seen a lot of people have success with Ensnaring Bridge. And now Ensnaring Bridge is a card that I've been really hesitant to get back to, and I'm open to it. I'll tell you that. I'm open to it. Because a lot of people talking about this as a tool to beat the Murktide decks and a lot of the bigger creature decks. But what I say to that is, we have enough problems trying to resolve a 3-mana sorcery against a tempo strategy. Do you really think you're going to resolve a 3-mana artifact against the tempo strategy? Okay, you're on the play, they cast Murktide on 2, you then cast Ensnaring Bridge. How many cards do you have left in your hand? Because that Ragavan is getting dashed at you. That Brazen Borrower, that 1-up Brazen Borrower that they have, that Otawara that they have, is bouncing your bridge. What do you do then? And after all your fetch shocking, you don't think those bolts are coming at your face? And then in the post-board scenario, they'll just beat you with Jace. You might not even get, sure, you have the Ensnaring Bridge, but then they Blood Moon you. And you don't have the turns to actually draw the lands you need to beat them on resources, beat them in the game, because then they have more time. They have better uses for the red. You will just accumulate cards in your hand that you can't even cast. And that's what I want to point out with Ensnaring Bridge. I see what you are saying, and I understand that you might have won 1 league, 1 game, 2 game, 3 games. But I want you, and I'm happy to help with this. I want to show you. I want you to show me if you can actually create a positive win rate with Murktide Regent, with Ensnaring Bridge in your main deck and your sideboard. I would venture to say you couldn't, because I don't think Ensnaring Bridge is enough. I don't think Ensnaring Bridge is the answer we need to Murktide Regent. Beyond that, do you think Murktide Regent solves Burn? Do you think Ensnaring Bridge solves Burn? Do you think Ensnaring Bridge solves the Crashing Footfalls matchup? You think Ensnaring Bridge solves the Yawgmoth matchup? Come on, folks. This ain't it. Next up, we have something like Into the Story. And the reason I bring this up is the Blink matchup. Now, the Blink matchup's terrible. It's a god-awful. It will absolutely... Blink decks, the 5-color Omnath deck, the Blink deck will absolutely run over Mill any day. It's just because of the amount of resources they have. They have the ability to deploy threats and answer our cards while keeping up on resources with things like Renin 6, Teferi Time Raveler, 5-mana Teferi, just continuously drawing cards and refilling their hand. I find that Into the Story is the only reliable card that actually beats that deck. And what do I mean by that? Sure, people can play Mesmericorp. Look, folks, I'm gonna be honest with you. Mesmericorp does not beat Blink. You have to play games, folks. I'm telling you, play these cards over a series of 10, 20, 30 games, and you will see Mesmericorp is not the solution that you're looking for. It does not solve the problem. They will have the endurance. They will have the Teferi to bounce it. They will have the counterspell for it. They will have the prismatic ending that beats the Mesmericorp. And what are you supposed to do then? You've wasted 2 mana on an artifact that does nothing for you. And then people will say, okay, well, Shaft, what about Ashiok Dreamrender? You're always saying Ashiok Dreamrender can be a solution to Blink. Well, Ashiok does more for you in other matchups. Ashiok beats the Titan matchup. Ashiok is a great resolve against empty boards, against many control strategies. It's a creature that will, it's a planeswalker that will punish all the greedy mana bases because you can stop them from searching. It beats Ren in 6. It does a lot more for you. And again, I want to circle back to Into the Story. I think if you're trying to beat the Blink decks as a mill deck, I think a 1 of Into the Story is your best bet. I think Into the Story is the only reasonable card because it catches you up on resources, and about half, I would say maybe 40% to 50% of the Blink decks will actually go down on counter magic. A lot of them just rely on Teferi Time Raveler, Prismatic Ending, and elemental-based interaction to deal with the format. So you can get away a lot of times. They will just tap out for permanence. A lot of times you can just get away with casting it Into the Story. And that brings you back on resources, and then you can start 1-for-1ing them again in the mid-game. So just something to think about. Finally, I think the thing that I was hinting about in the beginning of the video matters now in Veil of Summer. I think Veil of Summer and Sultai Mill has a reasonable means to return. Now, maybe not full Sultai, but I like the idea of splashing Veil of Summer in the sideboard. And I think the reason it's powerful is because of the prevalence of Thoughtseize and counterspells in general in the modern format. In Murktide, you're going to see Archmage's Charm, Counterspell, Spell Pierce. Veil of Summer is fantastic. You're going to be able to prevent them from stopping your resources from deploying, and then making up for it in dividends. You're going to get back the card. You're going to make back that card value, so it creates a little bit of velocity. Against the Death Shadow decks, you might be able to protect your own crabs. You stop them off the turn 1 Thoughtseize. They don't get any information, and you get a card back. There's a lot of things that Veil of Summer does, and I think with all the Force of Negations, all the counterspells, all the Spell Pierces around in the format, all the Flusterstorms, whatever it might be, Veil of Summer is actually a very powerful Magic card. And especially if you're expecting Flusterstorm, you might even just start the turn off with Veil of Summer to bait their Flusterstorm, to bait their counter magic so that they use up their mana, and then you can start deploying your resources once they've used that. So I think moving forward next week, I'm going to be trying, and in the videos to come, I'm going to be trying some Veil of Summer in my Dimir Mill sideboards. I'm going to be trying something around the realm of 3 to 4 instead of Mystical Disputes, instead of things like that. And for Murktide, I know Mystical Dispute can counter that, but I'm already opting to try more removal against those decks. So I think Veil of Summer is going to be pretty big, and that's what I think milled players should be looking forward to do. If we can't answer these decks outright, we should be trying to attack them from a different angle, create value at another angle, and think about what it means to include a card as a 1 or 2 of in our deck, and how much value that actually gives us in the long term. Now, I know that I fall into the trap of having a new pet card of Spreading Seas, but I do recognize Spreading Seas isn't the best card in the format right now. I mean, it does create land destruction against Urza Saga, but a lot of the main decks in the format right now are blue. You don't exactly want to give them blue mana, so I acknowledge that. But I think that's where the mill deck and the mill format and the mill archetype is. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Did I miss anything? Am I misevaluating certain cards? What do you think, and what are you trying to do in your mill games to try and improve your odds to win? And do you ultimately think that it's not worth it? Should we just wait for another set to give us another tool to help us kind of push ahead? Should we just wait on Modern Horizons 3? Let me know in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear what you think to continue the discussion. I'm going to end it right there. Remember that even the impossible is possible. And as we ponder that thought, I hope you'll join me next time as we take a glimpse into the unthinkable.